All right, let me hit record and then let me turn off my own and then I'll broadcast.
All right, here we are. We have our noon on Wednesday alarm letting us know that it is time for our research forum. So welcome to the November Crane Research Forum. I'm Janelle Williamson. I am the administrative coordinator here at the Crane Center, and we are very excited to have you here as guests and to hear from Dr. Lin. So my colleague Kathy will be in the chat box monitoring questions and comments in there and sending some housekeeping items, so keep an eye out there. And we'll also be doing a question and answer at the end of this session. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I will be asking Tzu-Jung those questions at the end. And now I am pleased to present our speaker of the day, Dr. Tzu-Jung Lin. Dr. Lin is an associate professor of educational psychology in the Department of Educational Studies, and she is a Crane Center faculty fellow. Her primary research interests focus on process of learning and developing in dynamic classroom environments, contextual and individual factors mediating or moderating the socialization of cognition and social relationships, instructional approaches to foster a positive climate and better learning in classrooms, and the psychology of reading and writing. So today, Dr. Lin is here with us to present her research on classroom social networks in early childhood education. So welcome, Dr. Lin. I'm going to turn my video and microphone off and turn it over to you, and I'll be back for question and answers at the end.
Thank you, Janelle, and thank you, Kathy, for setting up this Zoom meeting. It's my great pleasure to present my program of research on children's social networks in early childhood classrooms with you all today. I have been working on these studies with the Crane Center, many excellent collaborators for several years. This morning, Janelle and Kathy and I were just chatting about needing some kind of distraction from the election. And it's my great pleasure to serve as a distraction for you all. I hope this will help you guys have a refreshed mind for the rest of the day. So first of all, I want to thank many of my collaborators and the Institute of Education Sciences for supporting many of our work. When it comes to classroom social networks, there might be some terms that pop up in your mind, such as friendships, popularity, maybe power dynamics. Some of you may think of social media. And in our research, we define classroom social networks as any types of social connections that children form with peers in the classroom. And this is not to discount teachers' roles in the classroom, but since we are looking at classroom social networks through the lens of social network analysis, most of our analysis focus on peer interactions and the effects of peers. We have another line of research that focuses on teachers' input, which I think can be a valuable source information for you in my future presentation. So let me first define classroom social network in terms of its features. A network should contain learners and various forms of social interactions. One person doesn't constitute a social network, but when there are three people, a group of three people can be considered a social network. And these three people can be connected by different forms of interactions, such as play, which is one of the most commonly observed interactions in preschool classrooms, or negative interactions like aggression, bullying. And when multiple students are in the classroom, they form complex social networks. And these social networks has a structure. And the structure of the network can tell us a lot of things. For example, in this graph, you can see that the girl sitting in the middle of the network has the most of the connections with her peers. And this student tends to be the most popular students in the classroom. And there are students who are at the border of the network. These students may be more isolated, maybe less popular. And so social network researchers utilize the structural features of a network to explain a lot of social processes. And that's part of what I'm going to describe and share with you at the presentation today. Another important thing to know is in a social network, learners, a social network is influenced by learners' characteristics in the context of the network. When we talk about a classroom that's situated in a rural area, the network may look somewhat different from a classroom that's in an urban classroom, urban area. Or when we talk about third grade students' social networks, they may look somewhat different from a preschool social network. And not only does a social network influenced by learners and context, learners are also influenced by the networks in which they created. Another important feature of a social network is that it is constantly changing. It is very dynamic. So why do we need to understand young children's social networks? There are many reasons, and I provide at least 2 reasons here. The first reason is young children, as young as preschool age, they already form various forms of interactions and experiences with their classroom peers. For example, friendships, aggression, victimization. And many recent studies have shown that children's early social experiences are vital to their social and academic development. A recent study by Dr. Gary Ladd showed that children who experience victimization in early age, they tend to be chronic victimization, chronic victims throughout their lifetime. And same as friendship, children who have more friends in their early childhood, they tend to be more able to form stable friendship relationships with others. And so to help us understand these social experiences in young children's life, I created a poll and would like the audience of this presentation to answer these 2 questions. The first question is, what percentage of children do you think would have at least one best friend in a preschool classroom? And the second question is, what percentage of children do you think are so-called moderate victims in a preschool classroom? And we define a moderate victim as if students are asked, does anybody ever hit you, tease you, bully you? Students may answer 0, never, 1, sometimes, or 2, a lot. And for students who answer 1, 2, they are considered moderate victims. So please spend a minute or 2 answering these 2 questions. And while waiting for the results of the poll, I'm going to proceed with the next slide. So in 2016, our team received a 5-year grant from IES to conduct 3 studies that aim to understand children's classroom ecology or social networks from pre-K to 3rd grade. There are 3 aims. Study 1 aims to understand the policy and practices influencing classroom ecology. Study 2 aims to identify the dimensions of classroom ecology and how these different dimensions influence children's learning and development. And the third study looks at classroom ecology and its effect from a longitudinal perspective. And now I'm going to show you some interesting findings from study 2, in which we interview and work with over 2,300 students from 149 pre-K to third grade classrooms in Central Ohio in 2 years. So I want to know if the poll is ready to review. Okay, great. So what I see here is, with regard to the first question, the majority of you answer that about 20 to 40% or 40 to 60%, I think the percentage are quite even here, would have at least one best friend. And regarding victimization, there are more answers to 20 to 30%, right? So let's take a look at our findings. So we interview each individual child regarding who their best friends are, and children will nominate as many children as they can that they consider their best friends. And only the pair of students who mutually nominate each other as best friends would be considered true best friends. And this is our current findings. At preschool, about 58% of the kids have at least one best friend in class. And this number will continue to go up till third grade. The percentage go up to 84%. So if you answer 40 to 60%, that's the correct answer. And this is the score, the figure from the fall semester. In the spring semester, things do not change much. Pre-K kids still have at least half of the pre-K students have at least one best friends in class, and the number continue to be up as we look at older students. Regarding peer victimization, we found that about 30 to 33% of pre-K students reported being victimized at least sometime or always in the classroom. And I would consider that as a high percentage, 33%. Although the number seem to go down as we look at older students' percentage. It is concerning that children as young as preschool age, a lot of them have experienced victimization. And this number is consistent in the spring semester. And so if you answer 20 to 30% or over 30%, that would be the correct answer. So from these results, we can see that children's social networks are complex. They can form both positive and negative networks with their peers in the classrooms. And these networks can have long-term effects on their learning and development. So this really leads us to our next question. How do these interactions or relationships formed by the kids in the classroom? And more specifically, who do children form these social networks in the classroom? And so we have conducted a series of studies trying to answer this question. And we found some fascinating results that support a phenomenon called homophily. If you are not familiar with this term, that's fine. Another more layperson language to understand this term is birds of a feather flock together. Children who share certain characteristics tend to play with each other more often. And this is probably not that surprising. Research continuously to identify gender homophily and some behavioral homophily. In terms of gender homophily, research, including our own studies, show that children as young as 2 years old, they tend to play with their same gender peers. And these young children, they have a more relatively restricted sense of gender roles. A recent study by Xiao et al. Published in 2019 found that in these classrooms, some students even serve as a gender enforcer. And these kids can regulate their peers' behavior such that those kids don't play with mixed gender peers. It's very fascinating that children as young as preschool age can do that. Another homophily that's pretty common and robustly found is homophily of children with problem behaviors. Research that we published in 2016, 2017 show that children who have higher level of problem behaviors, they tend to associate with other children with problem behaviors. But those are very salient child characteristics. And some of those characteristics may not be able to be changed, such as gender. So we were asking ourselves, what about more malleable child characteristics? And by malleability, we mean that these characteristics can be modified or enhanced through education. So we conducted a study with 270 children from 61 rural preschool classrooms. And we asked the teachers in the classroom to report every pair of students' frequency of play. We also assessed children's malleable abilities, such as learning behavior, their language skills, literacy skills. And what we found was children do tend to interact more frequently with peers who demonstrate similar learning-related behaviors. For example, if I'm motivated to learn, I tend to have more friends who are also motivated to learn. If I tend to be distracted during learning, then my friends tend to have that distraction during learning. Another finding is children who share similar language and literacy skills. They tend to play with each other more often. And here is a graph that came from our study to show you how this homophily looks like. In this particular study, we randomly selected 5 students and the teachers were rated those 5 students in terms of their frequency of play. And in the first figure, these red dots refer to children's learning-related behavior. The larger the circle, the better their learning-related behaviors. And you can see that there's a thicker line between children who have bigger circles and much thinner lines between children whose the size of the circles show more differences. And this is supportive of the homophily hypothesis that children who share similar level of or type of learning related behavior, they tend to play with each other more often. And same thing with language and literacy skills. We show that children who have the same size or similar size of these circles, the association tends to be stronger. In another study that was conducted in in early childhood special education classrooms where children with disabilities are educated alongside their typically developing peers, we found another homophily phenomenon, which is disability. We call it disability homophily, meaning that children with disabilities tend to play with each other, and children, typically developing children, play with each other more often. And this study was conducted in 29 ECSE classrooms that are from Head Start, state-funded and private programs. And again, we asked teachers to rate the frequency of play, and this time we added another scale for teachers to report the level of conflicts between each pair of children. And the results do show that children with disabilities tend to play with each other more often, or they tend to have more stronger positive interactions. And children, typically developing children, they like to play with each other more often. But we do not see a homophily effect in, sorry, my correction. We do see homophily effect in both the play networks and the conflict networks. But we found that with conflict networks, boys seem to engage in more conflicts than girls. And we further zoom into one type of disabilities called developmental language disorder. This is defined as unexplained developmental language impairment or primary language impairment. Our question was whether children with disability, with this developmental language disorder would be more isolated in the classroom and may have suffered from the homophily effect. And the figure on the right shows you that children, the red color refers to children with developmental language disorder. And we do see that they tend to associate with each other more often. And the yellow color refers to children with other disabilities. And they also show some homophily. And typically developing children, they tend to have more interactions among themselves. And the square refers to children who are identified as isolate through our statistical analysis. And we found that children with disabilities tend to be the isolates in these classrooms. So now we talked about children tending to associate with their like-minded peers. What about cross-disability interactions or cross-status interactions? If we want a classroom to be more inclusive, we do want children to be able to engage in play or other forms of interactions despite their disability status, despite their gender, ethnicity. So this is just our first attempt to look at cross-status. By status, I mean disability status, play interactions, and what learner characteristics would predict their tendency to engage in cross-status play interactions. We found that based on the same study that I shared in the previous slide, out of all possible interactions, children form 65% of the interactions. And out of these 65%, 31% are same status interactions, and almost 69% are cross-status interactions. So that does suggest that children form cross-status interactions. But what predicts these interactions? Who tend to generate more cross-status interactions? And our study found that children who have better pragmatic language and self-regulation tend to form more cross-status interactions. And by pragmatic language, we define it as children's functional communication skills at school. For example, how likely they can say hi to other people, how likely they can respond to others with smile or appropriate facial expressions. And we even found that these pragmatic language skills can have stronger effects on children with disabilities than typically developing children when it comes to forming cross-status interactions. And we think this result is important because it suggests that there are certain skills that we can help children acquire to help to enhance the inclusiveness and positive social interactions in the classroom. And after presenting all these studies, you may now realize these social networks are either obtained from children's perspectives or teachers' perspectives. But one interesting question that we can ask is, do children and teachers perceive their social networks in the same way? And to answer this question, we zoom into one preschool classroom and conducted a so-called triple alignment study. So in this preschool classroom located in a nonprofit early childhood center, we collected network data from 3 informants. First of all, we asked children in the classroom to nominate their best friends. And we asked the teacher to report children's frequency of play among every pair of children. And we also conducted very intense classroom observation with trained researchers. And our findings shows that the child report network and the teacher report network are associated. The association is significant. And if we think of it from 0 to 1 as a correlation, the number is 0.33. So it's not bad. But the correlation between teachers' perception and researchers' perspectives is much higher. The correlation is 0.57. And when we compare between child perspectives and researchers' perspectives, the correlation is also higher than that of children and teacher report. So this suggests that children may have some unique perspectives of their social networks that either teacher or researchers do not have. That's why the correlation between children's perspective and teachers' perspectives are much lower than the rest of the correlations. And what's the implication of this result? This may affect how effective teachers are when they try to intervene in children's social network. And to answer that question, we conducted another study that focuses on teachers' conflict intervention. This study is conducted in the same preschool classroom as the previous triple alignment study. We asked children to wear a head-mounted camera and in a non-intrusive way, children wear the camera in the classroom to conduct their classroom daily routine and even play activities. And we observe, we let them wear the camera and have the teacher wear her camera during 4 days of 4 consecutive days during the fall semester. And then the conflicts were identified from these video recordings by a trained research assistant. And what we found from this 4-day observation is that there's a total of 159 peer conflicts identified from this period of time. And among these 159 peer conflicts, you may be surprised at the following number. The teachers, there were 3 teachers in this classroom, and we found that only 27 of these conflicts were intervened by the teacher, and most of these didn't yield a positive conflict outcomes. And there are many possible explanations to these findings. And the study itself has some limitations because it's only conducted in 1 preschool classroom due to some practical logistical limitations. But one of the possible explanations may be that the teachers perceive peer conflicts or the conflict networks in somewhat different ways than the children, which may have limited their inclination or tendency to intervene in those conflicts. And I want to use the last few minutes to talk about this graph. This is a network visual representation of the conflict network in this particular classroom based on our coding, human codings of children's conflicts from the video recordings. And one thing that we found was conflicts do not they are not evenly distributed among children. They tend to lie within a small group of kids, and those kids tend to be boys. And that's what this graph is about. Student number 1, number 8, number 4, and number 2, the lines among them are much thicker than the other children in the classroom. And this means that these children tend to engage in more conflict than others. And there seems to be some gender effects as well, because we see that there are 2 girls who engage in more conflicts than the other girls or boys. But again, we cannot generalize too much from this finding because of the limited sample size, but the study serves as a promising pilot study for future investigation. So to summarize my presentation, I want to share 4 major points with you, takeaway messages. The first takeaway message is young children can form complex social networks, and this their ability to form complex networks may sometimes be overlooked by adults or teachers. And I think it's educators' responsibilities to be more aware and attuned to these complex network evolvement. And children tend to associate with their like-minded peers. We have found gender homophily, behavioral homophily, learning behavior homophily, language literacy homophily, and disability homophily. And some of these homophilies seem to lead to a more segregated classroom social network. And this may be concerning if the goal of our education is to promote diversity and inclusion. But the good news is we also identify some important skills, such as pragmatic language and self-regulation that children can learn to foster more inclusive and equitable social networks in their classrooms. And our studies also indicate the need for teachers to be more sensitive to children's perspectives so that they can provide more timely and immediate support to their social development in the classroom. Well, thank you for your listening. This is the end of my slide, and I'm open to Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Lin. We have one question in our Q&A that aligns with a question I had as well. So I'm going to ask what's in the Q&A first, and then might have a follow-up if my question's still unanswered. So we have from Logan, it says, do you feel there is cause to expand this work on social networks beyond the classroom to understand the broader social networks in children's lives, including adults, family, and friends, and how these networks are moderating their development?
Thank you, Logan. This is a very important question that I think a lot of social network researchers are trying to do. A lot of the work within this field is limited by the methodological constraints. When we talked about social networks in these studies, we tend to provide or operationalize in a somewhat narrow way, treating each classroom as a bounded system. And the reason for doing that is we can easily monitor every child interaction and the network involvement. But it is important, as you said, to be aware that children are not just interacting with their classroom friends. They also have friends from their neighborhood. They also have important social connections with their families and other adults. And all of these social connections, according to the ecological theory, they all come together to shape individuals' lives and development. There are some researchers who use a form of social network approach called ego-centered social network to probe into individuals' network size and evolvement through these multiple different dimensions and channels. I think it is still a work in progress, and it is a worthwhile investment if anyone would be interested in doing it.
So there's a call there, anybody getting into that field of research. My question was somewhat related to that, and maybe your response does suffice with that. If specifically with the gender homophily, if people who have, or children that would have siblings that are the opposite sex, if that would affect the way that they play in the classrooms, if do you know if anyone has looked into that, or if any of your research aligns with that?
So you are asking if effects of siblings would impact their interactions with others? Yes. My guess is that there are people, especially from family sciences or developmental psychologists, they might have looked into this from a certain perspective. It may not be from a social network perspective, but they may be looking at influence of siblings along with their interactions with peers. I'm not familiar with that field of research, but and I have a sense that family sciences and the social network or peer effect research are still divided. They're not communicated well enough, and that's definitely something that we should pay attention to in the future.
That's great. Thank you. We have another question here from Scott. It says, Dr. Lin, based on your research, are there any racial differences in social networks in preschool?
That's a great question. I am aware of some emerging research about racial homophily or racial segregation with older children, especially adolescents, because that's a very popular question that researchers in our field want to know. I'm not aware of studies conducted in preschool classrooms. And in our own studies, we try to replicate racial segregation from the adolescent research, and we didn't find it. Our study didn't support that there is racial homophily, which is good news to me, and I hope that's good news to all of us. But I think the results are not a set stone yet, and it requires more replications.
That's very interesting. We have another question here. It says, what are your thoughts on a rule in the classroom that doesn't allow children to exclude others from their play? This is in reference to Vivian Paley's research on exclusion and inclusion play in the classroom.
Thank you for this question. I have another line of research that focuses on, it involves older children, 4th and 5th graders. And the focuses are to help students develop social perspective taking. And by social perspective taking, we mean that children are able to listen to others carefully. They are willing to be open-minded to different opinions. They learn to respect, and they are aware of differences, and they accept that differences can exist among them and their peers. In my opinion, I think that's one of the first things that we want students to learn about, to be able to understand that it is okay to be different. It is okay if other people are thinking of something that's different than ours. And I think if I were a preschool teacher, I would enforce this social rule in not just content learning, but any type of social activities in the classroom.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that explanation. This next question is from Sophie. It says, in the triple alignment results diagram, it looked like the teacher was less aligned with the lack of interactions or networks than both the students and the researchers. Am I interpreting that correctly? And if so, this seems consistent with some other research about teachers overestimating the good or strengths of students and minimizing the negatives or weaknesses.
Okay.
That was, I can say again if you need to.
Yes, I think I get the idea. I'm trying to go back to the slides. Okay, this one. So in this results, we can see that there are fewer lines in the child report network than the teacher report network. But I want to emphasize that this is in part because these networks were assessed in different scales. For children's networks, they are assessed via a so-called peer nomination approach. So the network is either zero absent or 1 present. And teacher report is a rating from 1 to 4. Never play with each other to always play with each other. And we just looking at these figures at the surface level, it does seem like teachers' networks look a lot different from children's network or even researchers' network. But I think that we have to take into account some measurement issues. But if you look more closely, just at the structural level, you can see that number 2, 8, and 10, 4, these 4 students seem to form a small circle. And that's more salient in the researcher's report, if you see the thicker lines among these kids. The children also reported that these 4 children tend to play with each other more often. But if we consider the intensity of these interactions, the researchers' perspectives are definitely more aligned with teachers' perspectives. I hope this answers some of your questions. I can't remember all of the details in that question, But if you would like more clarification, you can email me after this.
Yeah, so it sounds like some of it is due to the way it was measured. And then some of it is that there is more alignment between the students and the researcher report.
Right, yeah. But when we calculate these correlations, we take into account those measurement issues. It's just that when we do it, when we present it in a visual way, it's harder for us to tease out those problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have another question here from Rachel. It says, is there a way for teachers to be more aware of the complex social networks between children and and encourage inclusion between them?
That's a very good question. Some researchers in our field are trying to address this question actually through professional development. One idea that these researchers have is they would train teachers to read these social network graphs as part of the professional development training to help them be aware of what the classroom social networks looks like. Because when teachers are in the classroom, they're often overwhelmed with those social dynamics. They may not be able to put every pieces of information together into a network form like this. But oftentimes when we interact with our teachers and share these graphs with them, one of their immediate reactions was, oh, I never realized that my classroom looks like this. But I do know student A and student B seem to play with each other more often. And so I think it's a matter of how we help teachers move their understanding from a cognitive level to a metacognitive level, not just being cognizant of it, but they can metacognitively reflect on these networks and then change or adapt their instructional strategies accordingly.
Yeah, I guess a follow-up to that is so you have been able to present these networks to teachers and provide guidance. Is that what you're meaning by professional development? Are there other professional development opportunities for teachers that might not be participating in your studies?
I was only able to do it in a very informal way. That was not part of the designed intervention, but I am aware of at least one group of researchers in the United States. They're trying to develop this professional development for teachers ranging from elementary to high school.
That's great. Do you know the name of that researcher group? Or we could send it out later if you don't remember off the top of your head.
I can't think of their names on top of my head, but they are from the University of Virginia.
Okay.
There's Adolescent Research Center, something like that. Yeah, it's from that group of researchers.
Okay, so related to that question, well, we have a couple related to the things we've just talked about, but we'll start with the question related to what can teachers do? It says, related to Rachel's question, what classroom characteristics and instructive practices lead to the most robust or fewer isolated kids and ideal or developmentally appropriate social networks in classrooms? So what characteristics of a classroom and practices could lead to a less isolated classroom?
Thank you, Logan, for this question. Your question has been answered by some educational psychologists. One of the researchers I would recommend you to read her work is Alison Ryan from the University of Michigan. She published 1 or 2 studies in the past within the previous 5 years that look at whether classrooms' achievement goal structure would affect children's social network. But they're not talking about early childhood classrooms. Those are with early adolescents or adolescents. But what they found was that in classrooms where children value mastery goal orientations or mastery learning rather than performance-oriented learning. And for those of you who are not familiar with motivation theories, the main difference between mastery goals and performance goals is whether children learn because they want to learn, because they want to advance their skills, versus learning in order to compete with others, to win the first place, or to gain better scores. And they found that in classrooms that are more mastery-oriented and less performance-oriented, these classrooms tend to be more inclusive and more have denser connections among the peers.
That makes sense. We have quite more questions kind of related to any other strategies that you might suggest. So I think it's very interesting that, yeah, these classrooms that promote mastery over performance would be more inclusive. And I think that makes sense if you think about it. But if you have any other, there's more questions about strategies teachers can use. So if you have any final thoughts on this question, says what strategies teachers can use to modify the network structure and improve child outcomes.
Sure. This may not be a summary of what I just shared, but I'm excited to share with you that we have a paper that will be published soon in Frontiers in Psychology that looks at teachers' grouping strategies. When we think about grouping, the first thing that may come up to our mind is ability grouping children with who have similar academic skills. But there's much less research talking about grouping children based on their social skills or their social competence. And in our study, we look at teachers' self-reported grouping strategies and how these grouping strategies predict children's learning outcomes. The results will be, the paper we anticipate will be out soon. So please stay tuned. Look up my profile and I think you will be able to find that paper soon.
That's great. We'll stay tuned for that. Yeah. We have, I think this will probably be our last question, and it's related to the slide that you have up. Again, looking at these student versus teacher versus researcher reports. The question is, how would you explain the differences between the reports? And then besides the measurement differences, do you have any assumptions for this?
So when we look at these graphs, among the research team members, our first impression was children seem to be more conservative about their reporting their peer relations compared to teachers or researchers. We think that children's definition of friends or what counts as play may be more stringent than teachers' criteria or researchers' criteria. That's one possible explanation to the differences in the density of connections that we see from these graphs. But again, we don't have strong evidence to support that. I think that does require further investigations. But that again supports my previous point that children's perspectives and maybe their definition of friendships or their definition of play are very different from teachers and researchers. And it's important to identify what those differences are.
Well, thank you so much for presenting, answering all these questions, and thank you everyone for coming. This concludes our November Research Forum. We'll be back in the spring semester. So just a reminder that when you press leave the session, you'll be directed to a super short survey. So please fill that out for us so we know what we can be doing next time for our events. Thank you again for coming. Tzu-Jung, we can go ahead and sign off, and Kathy will end the recording and we'll be good to go. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I'll see you next time. Bye.